Hello. Today we are going to do a very brief lesson. What we are talking about today is CPCF, the corresponding parts of congruent figures. Now, when we've been proving that triangles are congruent, we've been going through these proofs to make a final statement where one triangle is congruent to another. But really, that's just the groundwork for what you can do inside triangles themselves. So let's look at this problem here. Let's say that this is the picture drawn for me. And what I know is AB is congruent to DE, AC is congruent to DF, and angle A is congruent to angle D. I also know that BC is 37 meters. Now, if I asked you, are the triangles congruent? Well, you could say yes, because side, angle, side tells me they're congruent. I have a side, the angle between, and the final side. So that means that these two triangles will have to be congruent. And then if I asked you, well, what then could you fill in that is currently missing? Well, you could say, well, I know that BC is 37 meters. And if these triangles are congruent, then that means that EF is also 37 meters. And that makes sense simply because those are congruent sides and they correspond to each other. That, in a nutshell, is CPCF. So CPCF just lets you fill in information when you know that triangles are congruent. So with CPCF, I could fill in 37. With CPCF, I could also tell you that angle F will be congruent to angle C. Because the triangles are congruent, CPCF tells us that these two will be congruent. Same thing with B and E. And we can do this in figures beyond triangles, but right now we're going to work with those triangles. So looking back at the assignment that you turned in today, number 3 actually asks not for triangles to be proven to be congruent, but for two angles that we didn't have before, B and C, to prove that those are congruent. Now what we did instead is we just proved that the triangles are congruent. But if we wanted to prove that the angles are congruent, well, that really only takes one more step. All you're going to have to say at this point is, well, if the full triangle is congruent, which we've proven, then that means any of the remaining corresponding angles, angle B and angle C, would have to be congruent according to CPCF, because that tells me the pieces are congruent if the full figure is congruent. And that's how these are going to change. For number 3, I'm still going to prove that the triangles are congruent, but to get that final step in, I'm going to add it and say CPCF, because that's what CPCF does. If you're looking at number 4 and 5, they're also going to be similar in that they're looking for a side and a side rather than the angles. Now, that does not mean you shouldn't figure out whether or not the triangles are congruent. You still want to prove the triangles are congruent. Because if you can prove the triangles are congruent, then you can use CPCF to say that these segments are congruent or that these segments are congruent. So all you are doing today is you are going to add that final step to number 4, proof number 4 from yesterday, and I want you to do proof number 5, finding the triangles that are congruent and using CPCF to take that final step. Aside from that, homework-wise, please check out Classroom. There's one other worksheet for you to complete on Classroom, and that means that I'm going to need you to submit that worksheet as well as the changes in your proof for number 4 tomorrow. We'll also have a quiz tomorrow. Check Classroom for details.